Good afternoon, everyone, and hello and welcome to the first workroom session of CAHP's Equity and Diversity Task Force. My name is Sarah Kinghead, and I'm a co-chair of the task force. I'm meeting you here today from where I live and work as a settler in the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg peoples in the Niagara region, covered by Treaty 3, also known as the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792. This area, steeped in millennia worth of Indigenous history, is part of the Dish with One Spoon covenant that calls upon all of us living within it and benefiting from this land to share in the responsibility for its care. Thank you, everyone. And at this point, I'd like to pass the floor over to my co-chair, Ryan Lee.
Thank you, everyone. I think we're just going to wait for a little bit longer to see if any latecomers come in. And again, thank you for coming to our first workroom session for the Equity and Diversity Task Force. I think that's everyone. We'll start. So welcome and thank you again for joining. My name is Ryan Lee. I'm co-chair with Sarah Head King. And we would like to just get started, and just some housekeeping rules is that feel free to leave your camera on. We ask that you please mute your microphone so that we can hear the discussion. If anyone has any questions, please enter it into the chat. We have members who will be monitoring the chat, as well as we have a Miro board going on. So if anyone wants to leave any additional comments or questions, there will be a link in the chat as well. And within Miro board, there's additional questions just to get everyone's thoughts as well. We also want to welcome everyone's views and opinions. So in order to create a safe space for it, please be respectful with everyone's comments. And for today's agenda, we just want to give a little background of sort of what is Equity Diversity Task Force. Everyone, it's a recently new task force that was created in 2019. What we do is we support CAHP board directors and the other committees to review and provide sort of an overall direction in promoting policies of equity, diversity, and inclusivity. And in this year, CAHP released a strategic action plan. And part of the plan is to advance sort of the dialogue of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So our goal today is to just gather information from members of CAHP and members of the heritage community on sort of equity, diversity, inclusion within the field. And today we assembled an amazing group of panelists to kick off our first session. And again, thank you for joining, and I'll pass on to Eli.
Thanks, Ryan. Hello, everyone. My name is Eli, or Elijah Sabadlan for some of you. I am joining in the unceded and traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, here also known as Vancouver. And I would like to introduce the panelists first and give them a bit of some time to introduce themselves. The first one in Cody Groat, assistant professor at Western University.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cody Groat. As Eli's mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of History and the Indigenous Studies program at Western University in London, Ontario. I am Kanyen'kehaka, or Mohawk, from Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve, I am a CAHP member since 2021. And I'll share more later.
Okay, thanks, Cody. The next in line is Stephanie Ma, Creative Director at GMO.
Thanks, Eli. Thanks, everyone here. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Ma. I'm the Creative Director at GIMO. We're a Toronto-based architecture firm that integrates design, sustainability, and heritage conservation. I'm also the current president of ACO's Toronto branch. ACO is short for Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. We're a nonprofit charitable organization. And I am also with the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada, and I sit on their Diversity, Equity, Inclusivity, and Sustainability Committee. And I'm going to follow suit with Cody and introduce more about myself after in terms of what my areas of interest are, where my identities intersect, and that kind of detail.
Awesome, thank you. And last but not the least, Maryssa Barras, Interim Executive Director at CAHP Canada.
Hi, so I'm Maryssa. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a queer archaeologist in planning of French settler ancestry, currently living on the Haldimand Tract, which is land 6 miles of either side of the Grand River that belongs to the Six Nations, and which is more broadly part of the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I will also share a little bit more, like everyone else, a little bit later on about my particular positions. I'm currently the interim executive director for ICOMOS Canada, that's the International Council on Monuments and Sites. And I'm also secretary of the Canadian Archaeological Association and primary investigator for the Points of Pride queer mapping project in Hamilton, Ontario. And then I am also a planning student at the University of Waterloo.
That's amazing. Thanks everyone for sharing. To start, again, my name is Eli. I'm a heritage planner at the City of Vancouver. And when I think about the terms equity, diversity, and inclusion, I think about having a seat at the table as a guest of honor, as a regular attendee, or sometimes even just as a last-minute invite to make sure there is no empty seat. When seated next to a stranger, one quickly has to adapt to the situation, and introductions matter. So for this gathering, I might share that I am a Filipino Canadian, that I was born in the Philippines and immigrated with my mom, dad, and older sister to Canada in April of 2001. Landed in Vancouver, but settled in Toronto until I finished high school in 3 years. No, let's be specific. It's an all-boys Catholic high school. And that time span is important because it meant that I was always a halfer, half grade 9, half grade 10. And it was up to me to decide who I want to graduate with, in essence, who I connected with better. In that sense, choices turns out matter. But back to the metaphor of a feast, who else is on your table matters. There will be the quiet ones, the ones that would only speak to the ones they know, and the ones who would dominate the conversation. There will also be the one who makes the most awful puns or stupid jokes. And if you don't know me yet, yes, I am the latter. For example, if I continue to ascend from my current position as a heritage planner, I could, and I have been practicing the sound of having the title Director of Punning. But I digress. How the conversations on that table would go throughout the feast depends on who gets to tell the stories, who will get the jokes or who will get offended, who will eat the most, who will eat the least, or not eat at all and complain about something, anything, or everything. So in recent past, I served on the board of directors of CAHP and the BC chapter, BC-AHP, and I volunteered my time for a seat at the table to make professional connections, to enjoy the meal while joining in or leading conversations on conservation however I can. And know that when I leave the table, that my hope is to leave with meaningful connections that turn into personal relationships with folks who I know I will continue the conversations for many years to come. But it's not always as easy as that. Getting an invite may be a struggle for some. Maybe that other one on the table who got to tell the stories, and the one next to them who didn't eat at all and complained about everything, you find out later on that they don't even really know the host, but their parents are good friends. A seat does not also mean a good reception from others. But when you do get a chance to talk to one of those people for a while, you had a lot in common and even exchanged contacts to keep in touch. But there's that one comment that somehow kept playing over and over on your mind after everyone left the table. Their comment on how great your command in the English language is and how they thought you would be wearing better attire to quote unquote dress for the occasion. Fast forward to a couple of years later, you did keep in touch with these folks. You did learn more from each other, and those comments that lingered in your mind for days, well, you realize and accept that they were the truth. You did have a great command in the English language, so much so that they trust you to spell check their work and use simpler words like talk instead of converse. And it is true that you did not wear better attire to quote unquote dress for the occasion because you couldn't afford them. But you were kind enough not to tell them that their shirt was inside out all that time. So choices matter. So going back to my colleagues, panelists Cody, Stephanie, and Maryssa, and to everyone, I hope that we get to ask the questions: what do the terms equity, diversity, and inclusivity mean to you, to your organization, to this organization? Why is it important and why do we talk about it? Who you are navigating this learning journey with? Where are each of us on our own journey, where we are as an organization, as a heritage sector, as a community, or as a nation when talking about it and identifying the issues at hand? And finally, how do we start these conversations, dialogues, working groups, anything really to address these issues, big or small, to affect meaningful outcomes, both immediate and long-term? So maybe I'll start with one question as a heritage professional. How or what issues do you identify? Well, I guess the big question is, how can CAHP better support heritage professionals in the equity, diversity, and inclusion within the heritage profession? Maybe we'll start with Cody.
Sure. Thank you, Eli, for your great introduction and for setting up this conversation. A bit more professional and personal context about myself. I have a bachelor's degree in history and youth and children's studies, but that's not relevant to this conversation. I have a master's degree in World Heritage Studies from the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom, based out of their Ironbridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage. That program was dedicated to the UNESCO World Heritage Site designation. So the University of Birmingham, UK worked closely with the World Heritage Center in Paris, France, to develop this program that looked at these international concepts of commemoration, outstanding universal value. They also looked at other World Heritage commemorations to UNESCO, including Memory of the World, based on documentary heritage and Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, which Canada hasn't ratified. After that program in the United Kingdom, I came back here to do a PhD in history, looking at the federal commemoration of Indigenous cultural heritage in Canada by the government, specifically through the work of the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada in designating national historic sites. And if all goes according to plan, I will defend that PhD thesis in April, so about 5 months from now. While I was working on this early research for my PhD thesis, I was introduced to a national not-for-profit called the Indigenous Heritage Circle, co-founded by a former CAHP member, Julie Harris, who's non-Indigenous. Sorry, she's not a former CAHP member, she's a current CAHP member, who is non-Indigenous. And this national organization sought to advance the cultural heritage priorities of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis community members. Now, I will get into that a little bit more later on when I talk about concepts of heritage and how Indigenous concepts of cultural heritage often deviate from Canadian forms of cultural heritage. But a lot of my professional expertise is through a history degree, writing about the commemoration of historic sites. I have not-for-profit experience with this Indigenous heritage organization, but I'm not really the conventional CAHP member, and that I'm not working in the field as a heritage professional actively on structures or things like that. So when I was looking at the membership, because Julie Harris had actively pushed for me to become a CAHP member repeatedly, I started to question if I fit within this organization based on my professional experience. And in front of me right now, I have the eligibility for a CAHP member, and I'm going to sort of read it off. It says education and training, knowledge of heritage conservation principles, work in a heritage conservation profession, work experience, including 7 years of heritage experience, post-secondary education relating to the field of heritage, or a diploma in the trades. And again, I really didn't check any of those boxes. My degree is in history. I'm not working in the field as a heritage practitioner, but I have had this work in national not-for-profits, which looks at reconceptualizing and better integrating Indigenous ways of knowing into the field. And that made me realize some of the structural problems associated with CAHP that might need to be addressed, which is how I'm finally getting to answer this question that Eli has so wonderfully posed. How can CAHP better support heritage professionals in the equity, diversity, and inclusion within the heritage profession? From my understanding, the membership of Indigenous peoples in CAHP is very low. And again, the people who are working within our nations or our communities on revitalizing Indigenous cultural heritage aren't necessarily looking towards professional expertise or academic training relating to conservation. There's some great people who are Indigenous who are working in the field, but we need to recognize that if we're going to expand our understanding of what it means to be a heritage professional, then we even have to look at how things like eligibility of membership, professional requirements don't necessarily reflect the training that Indigenous community members receive. One thing that really stands out to me is the concept of cultural landscapes. And we're seeing cultural landscapes being integrated a lot more into the practices professionally of organizations such as CAHP, this integration of natural features and built features as well. And again, from about 1999, the federal government and other bodies have started to really adapt this concept of Indigenous cultural landscapes, which recognizes that the tangible features that define Indigenous relationships might not be a building, it might be resource tools that exist on the land. I also see that Julie Harris has just joined in, which is wonderful because I was just speaking about her. So again, what we need to recognize is that when we are redefining ourselves as an organization and understanding what heritage professional might mean, we have to realize that some of these barriers to membership are actually going to very much limit our understanding in the future. Eli, I've sort of rambled, but I'll pass it back to you. Eli, you're muted.
You think after years of virtual panels will be okay? Just wanted to call in Stephanie, if you have any early thoughts about the question, the big question.
Sure. I might tackle the little question, but also go on a bit more professional and personal context like Cody did. So my background, where I currently work as a heritage practitioner, as a CAHP member, but really my education and my professional lens on heritage is very multidisciplinary. I studied history and theory of architecture at Carleton, as well as technology, society, and environment studies at Carleton. and also did digital media studies at OCAD. And so all of those intersecting interests of sustainability, of architecture, of communications led me to being working in heritage with the interest of acknowledging the important role that heritage can play in placemaking and in creating sustainable communities. And the other part of my work that isn't my day-to-day practice, but rather the lens at which I just experience life and navigate rooms that I'm in, is just my professional identities. So I'm a queer young woman, biracial, with 2 immigrant parents from very different countries. And so diversity, equity isn't something that I'm trained in professionally and that I specifically work in, but it's something that impacts just how I have experienced the heritage industry over the last 8 years. So with that lens, it jumps into the question, Eli, that you asked earlier about what is one major obstacle. I think acknowledging obstacles is super helpful for then trying to understand what we can do better. So I think there's a lot of obstacles. I think we're all going to get through like a little smidgen of them, definitely not all of them today. But the obstacle that I'll bring it to light today is the obstacle of just how our policy is written and how scripted it is. And the fact that that has resulted in a very narrowly structured approach to a lot of heritage conservation practice in Canada. And the fact that this ends up resulting in a lot of community narratives being left out because of the narratives that we prioritize through our policy.
Thanks, Stephanie. Maryssa, I'm going to put you on the spotlight now.
So I'll follow suit with the format that everybody else has set and kind of give you a little journey of how I got to where I am, a little bit of background on me. So I am, as I mentioned before, I'm a queer archaeologist of French settler descent. And I did my undergraduate degree at Memorial University of Newfoundland in archaeology with a minor in history. And then I did a master's degree also in archaeology at University of Toronto, working a little bit in between. And now I'm doing a master's of planning degree at University of Waterloo. And I think that kind of what brought me to planning is a really good kind of way to talk about how I experience the heritage field, because I, throughout my undergraduate and previous master's degree, was very involved in sort of like community organizing, especially student unions and like groups like that, and a little bit heritage groups, but I didn't kind of really take that on until maybe 3-ish years ago. And kind of what I found was like a real like separation of disciplines, separation between kind of these fields that I understood as being heritage and then the people who do heritage, the people who practice heritage. A lot of the work, a lot of the things that I've done, the experiences I've had have been very community-based. And I just really struggled with this disconnect of me working in a community on issues of heritage, like working especially in rural and remote communities, and then having all these people who have all this knowledge on how to manage their heritage and how to make it meaningful, and then like having that not connect with the way in which heritage as a sector and as a discipline like deals with things. I don't know if that's the most eloquent way of saying it, but like there was a real disconnect that I found, and I was kind of wondering like why all of this great literature on community archaeology, on community engagement, on like having meaningful practice didn't kind of translate to like things at a broader kind of policy level. and I pinpointed down that planning is where the things were happening. And I think I was very privileged to be able to figure that out because I had kind of the professional network, the support system to kind of make my way through to understanding that in a way that a lot of other people don't have access to. So I have a lot of friends who did history degrees who had no idea that they couldn't just become an archaeologist. Like they can, but that pathway is not quite as clear as if you're in an archaeology degree. And that disconnect, I think, also translates to archaeologists who are like thinking like, oh, I'll go start a career in CRM, not knowing that you have to do like 5+ years of digging in a precarious employment in order to be able to kind of move your way up. And from an equity perspective, that kind of precarity and not having a clear pathway really advantages people like me who have a great support network and disadvantages people who don't. And the people who have great support networks are not not as likely to be marginalized peoples as people who do have great support networks. With that said, I kind of want to echo some of what Cody said in terms of membership. I think that there's some really critical structural issues with how membership is so closely linked to academic experience and to education. Yeah, somebody just commented the definition of heritage professional is very narrow. I completely agree with that. There's a lot of people who are heritage professionals who do things like masonry, who do things like blacksmithing, who don't have a degree, who aren't part of university, who can apply for student membership. They can apply for an internship membership because you need to have completed post-secondary studies, and who just have no way of kind of entering these spaces. And I think as well, from just another perspective, like even at the student level, asking for things like a CV seems really intuitive, like, oh, we kind of want to know who's coming there. But I would really challenge like everything you ask of someone when they come to apply to be a member is something that's turning someone away. Because if you're a student who's only thinking of becoming a member of CAHP because you kind of think that's where you should go, and then you see, oh, I have to apply with a CV, and all I have on my CV is that I've worked at a grocery store. Like, you know, the impact of that means that it turns people away. And when you have people who don't have the luxury of not working while they're doing a degree, who don't have the luxury of kind of being able to like sit back on a support network while they try and fiddle their way, volunteering in labs, volunteering to support people. A lot of volunteer work happens to like bulk up your CVs. It turns people away, and it makes kind of a really hostile experience to even try to become a member. So I think I'm going to stop there because I want to leave space for other people. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts, is echoing some of what Cody said, but for the intern and student level, in addition to that professional member level.
Thanks, everyone. I think that's a pretty good start, and it's great to kind of get more understanding of where your come-froms are. Almost everyone kind of talked about the membership topic, particularly the obstacles in the eligibility, professional requirements, and all of that. And I think it's also been said about like the whole like the separation of disciplines, or like the silos that we kind of live in. So when it comes to situations where you find yourselves in, how do you catch yourselves from just being in your personal bubble, or how do you disrupt the status quo? Any early thoughts on that? Not necessarily It doesn't necessarily have to be big, but it could be just like a small event. Like for me, an example could be like recalling a discussion from a professional colleague who I thought I shared values. And then realizing once we start talking about the deeper or the heavier subjects, policy related subjects, that that they do have concern about reconciliation or decolonization, or the use of the word privilege or intersectionality, because these are just buzzwords or products of social engineering. And how do you continue that conversation or that dialogue so that you still have that positive space to actually do something better, rather than just kind of like close off and retreat to your safe space.
I can chime in quickly just with a really small example that I think addresses your question, Eli. In the Department of History, where I work at Western University, we have the longest, or the oldest, I should say, public history graduate degree. I believe the Western Public History graduate degree turns 40 years old this next year. And one thing that we always look at is how, again, there are these silos that have been established professionally with heritage and conservation and public history, how it's kind of deemed these very different fields. And in a lot of ways, it is this different, theoretical as opposed to practical, you might be able to say, in some of these fields, or commemorative versus restorative. There's a lot of these divides that take place. Some of the classes that I teach, though, on a recurring basis, including Indigenous peoples and public history, shows how none of these concepts really reflect what Indigenous peoples perceive as cultural heritage. So public history isn't a concept that really works, or heritage isn't really a concept that works as well. So we look at a lot of these discussions: built infrastructure, cultural landscapes, the role of Indigenous languages in telling us about the significance of specific sites, or how humans have interacted with these specific sites, and how those languages have been erased through colonial projects as well. So I think, Eli, I'm not sure if that directly addresses what you're saying, but I think that's an example of how we're looking at this field and we're finding ways to intervene that build upon sort of our expertise and experiences.
I think I'm struggling a little bit to come up with an answer, Eli, only because the idea of retreating into a safe space is interesting, because I don't think I've felt that there has been much safe space in heritage. And so it's been more of a priority for me to create safe space, less so I've had privilege in the most recent years of my career to be surrounded by very supportive colleagues who I feel very safe around. But I think entering the heritage industry at first, it felt very glaringly obvious to me that while I felt like I had the professional education that meant I should be there, my identities showed me that I didn't feel like I was meant to be there. And so I think it's been more important for me in the last couple of years to try and speak out about that, to create safe spaces for diverse communities in the heritage world. And so, like, one example of that is in the last year, I've hosted a session called Heritage for Whom? Conserving Community Spaces at a bunch of different conferences, the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada conference, the Ontario Heritage Conference, and the National Trust for Canada conference this past year. And in hosting those, I've found that it's been, the intention of them is to try and create space for these conversations so that people feel safe to express themselves, to discuss the barriers that a lot of people are facing in equity, diversity, and inclusion in heritage. And I was just talking to Maryssa about this the other day, where we noticed, because she's been in one of those sessions, that the audience at those ends up being quite diverse, which on one hand is really heartwarming. It's very exciting to see. And it feels like it's maybe hopefully being effective in creating a safe space. But then the other challenge is realizing that the audience in those rooms is different than the audience we're seeing in other heritage rooms. And so I think there's a possibility of that happening here today too. I think I'm super grateful for everyone participating in this today who showed up. But I think there's probably a good chance that a lot of people who need to hear these conversations aren't here right now and didn't take the time to join this conversation. So I think having these help create a safe space, and then a priority we need to have all together here is to make sure that these conversations go outside of workrooms that have the title Equity, Diversity, Reconciliation.
I just to kind of tag on to the conversation and to answer your question, Eli, I know something that I have very consciously been trying to do for the last 5-ish years, maybe a little bit longer, is kind of challenging people to think really critically about what they say versus what they do. There's a lot of conversations that have been happening over the last little while about kind of like equity, diversity, inclusion, how to make spaces safer. And you hear a lot of people having really good intentions, but when it comes down to it in meetings where decisions can be made, people tend to shy away from making bold decisions, from really kind of taking a stand. Like people are really quick, kind of broadly speaking, to make these like harassment policies, anti-racism policies, and these kinds of things. But when it comes to really enacting them, a lot of the time you kind of see people shy away and say, well, we need to see the whole like situation, and then the things take time. And personally, when I see those kinds of things happening, they make me feel like the space isn't safe. If I like the impact of that hesitancy, the impact of not seeing people take action on what they promise, makes spaces unsafe. Because if you see people talk and then not follow through, then like I know that that space is not necessarily going to do what people say they will do. I think as well, there's kind of, yeah, there's another piece to what I wanted to answer your question with it in terms of like what the impact is of that over a longer term, where if people are feeling unsafe in spaces or aren't sure, they have to like feel out to figure out if this space is safe for them to enter, then that takes time away from their ability to enter that space earlier on. And if you become a member of CAHP or a member of any heritage organization at the age of 19, you've got an edge over everybody else because you started to build a network. You started to find potential employers. Like you've started to figure out, oh, if I want a career here, I need to do X, Y, Z. But if you are looking at this space and thinking, well, this doesn't feel particularly safe, so I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to try and find a different one. And you've lost 2-3 years of trying to find where you belong. Well, that's 2-3 years of networking, 2-3 years of advantage that you've lost to someone else who doesn't have to have those concerns. Something that I heard somebody say quite recently is that in heritage isn't a sector, isn't a career that you start, it's a career that you find yourself in. And I just kind of really felt a need to like challenge that kind of thinking, like, why isn't heritage a career that you can just start in? Why is this something you find yourself in? That to me is like a problematic perspective, because if it takes 5 years of networking and building to enter this field or enter this sector, that's for somebody who is of a marginalized community is probably exponential, like likely to be more like 10 years. Yeah, we went off in a couple different directions, but I think that, yeah, building off of what Stephanie and Cody were talking about.
Still trying to figure out my mute Yeah, I think that's really great. Stephanie, you brought up a really interesting thing where it's amazing to see these kinds of dialogues where the audience is so diverse, it's exciting, but then you go to the rest and you actually see big difference. So in terms of that, those kinds of differences, and from your personal experience, and I think some of you have already touched on this, how do you create those positive and supportive spaces as in your role to learn, unlearn, address these issues, and if they worked, how? And then if inversely, if they did not work and something blew up, I think someone on the chat mentioned that it's really tough to pivot from hardware. When opinions are so polarized, it's hard to break into a good conversation that results in learning for all. What happened, if that ever happened to you folks, and what lessons did you gain from those experiences?
If Stephanie or Maryssa want to go first, feel free. I don't want to keep our structure.
I'll chime in with a quick one. I think it also builds on Maryssa mentioned earlier, like the challenge of volunteering and that not everyone has access to volunteering. I think this has been something being in the industry, wanting to try and understand what are barriers to heritage. And I think one of them is the fact that in, I think it was a 2017 survey by the Government of Canada, they did a survey on heritage institutions across Canada, and it found that volunteers in heritage outnumbered paid employees 3-to-1. And that means that 75% of our workforce is 2017. I don't know what it is today, but is volunteer. And I have brought up in multiple conversations that I think this is an equity challenge, because volunteering is ultimately a privilege, and having time to spend on volunteering on what is often unpaid labor, if you're having to work multiple jobs, you don't have time to volunteer, but that's such a big part of heritage. And in bringing that up in some one-on-one conversations, I have personally offended some people because they volunteer, and caveat, I volunteer, I'm with ACO, and I've been volunteering for them for a very long time, and that's because I have the privilege of time to do that. But I think being able to acknowledge that multiple things can be true at once. So hearing that volunteering is a privilege can offend people, because they'll think, well, I'm giving so much of my time, I'm really passionate about this, you should be grateful for my time. And it's not that I'm saying that I'm not grateful for people volunteering. It's just acknowledging that not everyone is going to have access to volunteering. And that's a huge way of getting into the industry and having your say and getting to choose whose heritage gets represented, getting to choose what is seen as valuable. And so if we acknowledge that not everyone has access to get to make those choices of what is heritage, what is valuable, we can start to acknowledge that we need to each start rethinking our priorities, rethinking whose stories are we telling, and that we have a responsibility, if you do have the time to volunteer, to think about those things and have this lens of diversity and equity. So I don't know if I communicated that in the moment when I was speaking with people. It's kind of happened thinking about it later and how to communicate it. Maybe I communicated it really poorly right now and I just offended someone. I have no idea, but.
One thing I might want to add just right off of Stephanie's comments, and I feel like this is a good industry to say this to, and as Stephanie said, it might cause anger, but unpaid internships in general are one of the most exploitative things that are allowed in this country in a lot of industries. And I will stand by that because this is a field where we see those still to some degree. And again, it really forces specific people out of the profession. I grew up in a very low income family, reliant upon food banks for various instances. And again, if there's unpaid internships, you can't do it. It's going to put you out on the streets and you can't get into the profession. And that is 100% an equity matter when it comes to those from low income families. And again, it influences what we deem as relevant. The grand structures that survive architecturally are the ones that survive for a reason, because those are the ones that are deemed legitimate and worth preserving. But I'm going to deviate from that a little bit because there's one other thing I wanted to introduce to the discussion. And Maryssa, I think if you have comments on that as well, I hope I'm not deviating you away from that. But just going back to a last comment on membership, because I will expand it more and get to a relevant point. We look at the requirements and it mentions sufficient exposure to the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada. And one thing that always catches my eye about that and the practices that it upholds is consideration of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, which is something that I work closely with. I'm going to shamelessly self-promote and say that the Indigenous Heritage Circle released a great report on UNDRIP and cultural heritage in Canada, which won the National Trust Governors Award. But again, that's irrelevant. That's shameless self-promotion. Article 11 of UNDRIP says, for instance, Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their culture, such as archaeological and historic sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, visual performing arts, and culture. So one thing, thank you, Miranda Jimmy, for sharing our report. One thing that catches my attention when reading that relating to CAHP is this idea of residential schools as architectural heritage. We're seeing a lot of examples where community members are deciding to tear down residential schools, to burn them. There's few remaining structure that's part of internal healing processes. But again, I've seen people in the heritage industry cringe and say these need to be preserved. And it's not just residential schools, it goes to museum practices as well. This idea of cultural resource management. We see museum artifacts put behind display cases when they're meant to decompose, and that's part of the natural life cycle of these cultural items. And all of that is sort of touching upon the field of heritage more broadly, including structural features, how some things are meant to decay, totem poles, longhouses, that they're meant to decay as part of natural cycles of life. So I think, again, when we start integrating UNDRIP and realizing that Canada's conservation principles are not neutral by any means, they're written from a very specific mindset, then we can start to understand that a lot of our guiding documents need to be revisited. I deviated a lot from your question, Eli, but I wanted to fit that last little part in. And Maryssa, I'm sorry if I deviated from what you might have said.
No, it's all good.
Can I jump in, or do you want us to go
Totally.
back to your question? Because I would like to build up of some of that.
I do have something to say further to Cody's last comment about the residential schools, but I'll let you go first.
Okay. Well, it's probably better if you go first, because I'm not unrelated, but gonna go to more questions about identity of the heritage sector. So maybe you should go first.
Okay, fair enough. I think Cody brought a really good issue that we have in our current understanding of conservation. And I've sat on a as a grant, what do you call it?
Reviewer,
thank you. And one of the things that this grant is kind of trying to improve on is to make sure that projects from Indigenous peoples can be introduced, but then the requirements are still the same. That you need to have a statement of significance, that you need to have a photo, and you need to actually place it. But really, when you're talking about those kinds of accessibility to these grants, it's a little jarring that you even have to ask about, oh, you need to take a photo of this, because it's a sacred place. And if it is a burial site, you really don't want to even ask for that. But some communities are just really wanting to get that grant, and so that is their access to it. But then the discussion also with when we're deliberating, there were a lot of, it was still a respectful deliberation, but it was kind of tough because I can't speak for the Indigenous nation that is applying, but from a cultural competency, it almost feels like you always have to say, well, no, you can't really do that, and it's really inappropriate. And I think it becomes an issue of like, how can we, as like the system of this grant program, allow and evolve in the future to actually provide meaningful changes to the structure. Anyway, Maryssa.
I think that was great. I have some thoughts on that as well. As someone who, I started my project Points of Pride with a bunch of my friends, and we had no access to funding because we weren't incorporated. And like, incorporation is another barrier of like, if you don't know how to incorporate, you don't have someone with skills to navigate like how to create bylaws and things like that, and also capacity, because my group, we do have someone with those skills, me, but do I have capacity? No. So we don't have access to a bunch of grants. We don't have access to those kinds of things. And I think that there's just kind of that added layer for kind of community work that isn't able to kind of incorporate. A lot of grants are only accessible to people who are incorporated, which is just an aside of additional barriers. But I think that what you said segues well into what kind of I wanted to touch on, thinking from what Cody and Stephanie had said as well, is I think that there's a need to kind of think of what the heritage sector is, and what the relationship between heritage professionals and the broader like sector and what heritage is, like how that manifests. Because like, to me, heritage is community. Like, heritage value only exists when people are there to relate to it. And if the people's relationship with that thing no longer exists, like, is it heritage or is it just something that we've decided to preserve? And with that comes a need to recognize that how people relate to that thing dictates how that heritage should be like ultimately managed, right? Like if people's relationship with heritage dictates that it shouldn't be preserved, then that needs to be respected. And like what heritage professionals think based on their rule book is not necessarily, I think, what is kindest to like the communities who ultimately are the heritage. Something as well that I just kind of wanted to plug in is there's a lot of discussion that I hear more broadly about like the future of heritage and where we're going as a sector and how to define the identity of the heritage sector and heritage professions, like for the future, how can we move forward? But there's a really distinct lack of young people of engagement with emerging professionals, of engagement with students. Like it's quite distinct, that lack of input. I mean, I think Cody, Stephanie, and I are all pretty young, which is great, but like we don't have anyone who's 21. And I recognize that there's some nuances to how things operate that like those people may not be able to bring to the table, but there's also, they are the people who will set the vision for the future. Like they have a perspective that's just not voiced on where the sector should be going. And I think that that's kind of something important to consider as well, because like ultimately in 50 years, if we're trying to vision what the heritage sector's identity is, how can we make it more inclusive for the future? We should be talking to the people who will be there as well, including them in these conversations. And to bring it back around to membership, if they can't be members, how are they supposed to be involved in those conversations? Yeah, lots of looping around in that.
Thanks, Maryssa and everyone. I'm just trying to check in with the chat room as well. I think we only have a couple of minutes left. One of the questions that we received from Jerry, I expect that CAHP can make dramatic improvements to its acceptance criteria. I think everyone kind of touched upon that. Any other thoughts to add about that, about applicability and effective skill sets or experience that do not fit within relatively narrow description?
I sort of have to leave right at 1 o'clock, but what I'll add to that, Eli, is, I always think, for example, about the role of elders and knowledge keepers within a variety of Indigenous nations who help provide contextual knowledge about cultural landscapes, their stewardship, their preservation. And again, I think that there could be language in the membership about within your cultural framework, what expertise or experience do you have that has helped guide your work or help makes you qualified to engage in these conversations. And I think that's the way that you can approach it. Again, within the cultural frameworks that CAHP has previously used, we have these ideas of credentialism, of internship hours. But again, if you consider within different cultural contexts, what is the knowledge base or experience that you have that has helped legitimize your role as a heritage practitioner, what we would view as a heritage practitioner. So it's just sort of one example, but I'm sorry, I can't hear what Maryssa and Stephanie have to say. Thank you everyone for letting me join this, by the way.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thanks, Cody. Any other last minute thoughts? Maryssa?
I think just on, you've heard a lot of my opinions on membership, but I think that kind of like what Cody said, there needs to be changes in definitions for like who can enter in what capacities. And I think like more broadly, because of my earlier comments on heritage as being community, there needs to be space for people who aren't necessarily even professionals and just people who are experts in heritage without necessarily being a heritage professional, if that makes sense. Like there needs to be space for people who have vested interests. As the like one great example is when I was working in rural Newfoundland, there was a man who he passed away a while ago, but he was the village broom maker. He made birch brooms, and he was very interested in, while he was alive, kind of spreading that knowledge of those birch brooms. And he wasn't a heritage professional, but he had a vested interest as someone with a very specific heritage craft, figuring out how he could work to pass those things on. And I think that there needs to be space made for people with those kinds of relationships with the heritage sector. Perhaps a different type of like option for being included in conversations. But I think, yeah, that's something that needs to be thought about.
Thank you, Maryssa. Stephanie, do you have any final comments, or can I close?
My final very quick comment, which won't be fully formed, but I'll form it more in the Miro board, is that I think we also need to make sure that these conversations are spreading to other aspects of the work we do. And so I think sustainability is a huge thing when Maryssa's talking about what's the future of heritage. CAHP just released a green paper, which is really excellent, but I think we need to make sure that we're acknowledging that the climate crisis is going to disproportionately affect historically marginalized communities. And so sustainability is a reconciliation, diversity, equity issue as well. And all of these things need to be communicated all together, not just in this room. But yeah, I'm excited to keep talking with everyone on Miro.
Awesome, thank you. On behalf of all of us, I just want to say thank you to Sarah and Ryan for hosting this, for the CAHP Equity Diversity Task Force, Ria, Chris, and Colin, for providing this space. As everyone knows, we don't have enough time to go through it all. And I sincerely hope that this could continue the work that this organization committed to get better at, and ignite within us the curiosity to promote dialogue within your communities, personal and professional. Assume responsibility, most importantly, to contribute meaningfully to these conversations. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.
And thank you, Eli, for your masterful moderation, and to our panelists, Cody Groat, Stephanie Ma, and Maryssa Barras. Have a great weekend.
Have a good one.